Hi everybody. Chapter 6 is the last chapter in Bryk that we will be covering in this class. This gives you the opportunity to read this book on your own, view it, and if anything can help you, it can certainly help you. This is stuff that can help you, add a summary and conclusion that you can use to write your own paper. If you're doing a paper in this class, which as you know, we're really not because we're at a condensed schedule, but I want you to use the rest to develop your paper. Any of these topics can be used to develop your paper if you're working in a community-centered environment. And if you need anything else moving forward, this stuff is good and it can eventually help you when it comes time for your dissertation. Since these are the conclusions, if you're doing something on community relationships and that type of relationship, this is really going to help you. So trust was improved in smaller schools if opportunity for community was created. So you have to know that class and income were linked to school improvement, really, honestly, based on this study. So this study showed that school improvement occurred regardless of income during a major reform initiative. But once the improvement occurred, then income and class stagnated school reform. So that created a challenge. So if you came in, as the authors in Bryk did, they did everything right in the beginning, then there was a problem. So once the improvements occurred, class and race prevented further improvement from occurring, which is interesting. So it's important that you know the different types of sample schools that were used in this study. Predominantly African American schools were across the entire spectrum of socioeconomics. I think this is important because they were in the poorest and the wealthiest of areas, meaning that we did have African American segregation where the rich African American parents and students all went to the richer buildings. That did happen. Latino and African American mixed schools were closer to the middle. Racially diverse schools were close to the higher levels of socioeconomics, but not as close to some of the ones that were in the wealthiest areas. And the integrated schools, which were 30% white and Asian, were primarily in the highest socioeconomic levels. All that this is doing is showing you and justifying why we study socioeconomics and why that's important in our school system. So Bryk stresses that even though these were higher income areas, they were not heavily advantaged. They had a 60% minority enrollment and 70% of the students on average qualified for free or reduced lunch. So yes, doesn't mean that they were necessarily super wealthy, but they did have advantages of wealth. So decentralization comes with stagnation. So schools that experienced decentralization, that weren't integrated schools, stagnated because they were staying the same. They weren't getting different perspectives, and once the improvement occurred, they peaked. Some schools beat the odds, but most of them did not. And I think that's a big idea when we're looking at the Bryk research. So one of the things that the authors did specifically was look at community factors to see if anything else stood out. Stagnating schools had a relatively high percentage of students living with non-parental guardians. Once again, I think this is big, and I think this is important if you were doing a community study, but let's think logically and let's think organizationally. Can you get all this information from a school system? It's pretty hard to get schools to admit this is what's going on. But different demands, foster care, homelessness, having lived in households with domestic violence, were extraordinary circumstances that caused schools, it was difficult to sustain the improvement. So you could look at this as a lack of parental involvement if you were doing school and community. So one of the things that Bryk notes is there are positive consequences of social capital in low socioeconomic environments. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. If there's a low socioeconomic environment and there's a massive crime wave that happens, the neighborhood does sustain and they do come together, which the neighborhood coming together could benefit schools. If there are different governance problems, different arrangements that they think that individuals in these populations think are unfair, they can also mobilize together for this. But you also have to know the negatives of this. When this occurs, there's less likelihood to participate in community-based organizations, and there's less chances to report different problems that occur because most people don't want to admit them. If urban residents feel isolated, they can't connect to their local community, they can't be involved, they're not going to see the point of school. Because in their eyes, the structure and the point of schooling really is nothing more than just just an escape, but it doesn't do anything in the long run. So bonding and bridging social capital. If you're doing anything on community-based learning, you need bonding social capital is easy. This is people coming together in the community. Whoop-de-doo, we all know that. But bridging, you might not have seen. Bridging really is when external individuals and organizations outside the community come together and work with you. This gives children the opportunities to see different areas, different experiences. It gives adults the opportunities to potentially find better jobs. And it can improve tutoring opportunities inside and outside the school as well. So I would argue this also is a very big idea. So religious institutions do work well with lower socioeconomic status. In African American communities, there is normally a high rate of religious participation. This itself, if the school is smart enough to participate in partnerships with the religious institutions. And I'm not talking about religion in schools. What I'm talking about is tutoring opportunities in those religious institutions. That could be a big idea. So my question that I always ask are, do you know of any public schools that have good partnerships and relationships with religious institutions? And if you do, and you don't think it's going to cause a problem, this is certainly something that you might want to explore. So when we talk about crime in Chicago, you need to know that crime in Chicago was biggest in the 80s. It's declined significantly, and it continues to decline in Chicago. It'll spike every so often, but crime in Chicago right now is nowhere near as bad as it was in the 1970s or 1980s. So at the time of this study, the crime rate declined in Chicago. But that doesn't mean that there weren't violence and drug problems. There are always going to be violence and drug problems in Chicago. I don't see that changing. Parents worry about outside sources causing these violence and drug issues at night. So evening meetings and school community events sometimes did not have attendance. So they had to be creative in the way that they scheduled these events because they didn't want crime and violence to be a barrier for them. So Bryk had access, and he looked in terms of students in foster care. He called that an extraordinary circumstance. There were few students in foster care that showed major improvement gains, but there weren't many students in the population in general in foster care. So think back to your REMS courses. If you took a REMS course that looked at sample size, the sample size of students in foster care was very low, but there were enough that showed that there weren't major improvement gains. So one of the things that Bryk suggested that was a finding was we can improve this if we actually work with stakeholders within the school to work with foster parents. So community social capital used religious participation and collective efficacy. I would argue efficacy is stronger because religious participation, we could make the argument there's a separation between parent involvement in church and state. I certainly would say we could feel that way in the year that we're in right now, but it was different in 1995. That's 20 plus years ago, and that data is going to be much different in terms of religious participation than it would be today. So the questions that were asked were interesting. They said, would neighbors intervene if they saw graffiti being painted? Or truancy? Would they help each other? Do they participate in religious organizations? And is it something that their household does on a regular basis by speaking to a religious local leader? They used Chicago Police Department statistics to determine what types of crime happened around the school. If you're interested in the data, I would suggest you look in the appendix. I'm not going to give you specifics on the data. We're just talking about what it is. And that was the bonding social capital. This stuff is a no-brainer. It's stuff that anybody's going to look at. Now, bridging social capital, I think, is interesting. Asking respondents to report on any friends or connections they have outside of the neighborhood is huge, because that shows adults there's a way out, which in turn will show students there's a way out. So if you had a high number of friends outside of the neighborhood, you were likely to have higher social capital. So the Center for Children at the University of Chicago looked at Department of Family Services and looked at social services delivered in Illinois. I need to stress this again because this is why I like this study, but it's also why this is a bang your head against the wall study. You are not going to get this information Even if you're a principal or a superintendent at a large school, nobody's going to give you this confidential information unless you have something invested in the community, which is going to give you access to, but I don't see it happening. Relationships make this stuff happen, and you need those relationships. So, I like the table on page 175. We found that church membership came more from Latino and racially integrated schools. More chance of outside connections happen in racially diverse schools, and 1/4 of the students in schools that were considered truly disadvantaged are abused and neglected. Once again, though, I question how did they define abused and neglected, and how did they get that information? Because in your cases, you probably wouldn't get that information. So, linking community factors to school improvement. So, Bryk says it all. He says, the composition of the community does matter, and basically, we can't change it. But we can use social capital as a potential predictive variable. We can't use it as an independent or a dependent, but we can use it as a predictor, and that's huge. And on your research studies, that might be something that you want to do. So a quick look at some of the evidence that was presented. They only looked at high and low characteristics. So they eliminated anything that was in the middle. So if you've watched all 6 of these videos, you've seen that Bryk basically sometimes only used the middle and sometimes only used the top and the very bottom. They do this to show whether or not the category is different in the best or worst performing schools. And in terms of community, this is a good idea. One of the things that you could do if you ever get in a faculty position and you're working with large data sets, you work with a research team, and you have the research team look at this stuff to see whether or not they can support the characteristic or make an argument against it. So what did we find? We found that religious participation had a significant impact on reading, significant impact on math, and a difference in attendance. They found that collective efficacy and outside connection were both the most significant in mathematics performance. And this surprised me. I thought reading here. Earlier on in the book, when we looked at some of Bryk's factors with parent involvement, not community involvement, math was likely to improve by a grade level in the 4th if parents knew what they were doing. So if there were outside connections outside the school district, mathematics improved as well. So this study is a good justification for community-based math. Everyday math is also a curriculum that's used very prominently throughout Chicago. So crime rate, percentage of students abused or neglected were more likely to improve attendance, reading, and mathematics in high-performing schools, but not low-performing schools. What that means is that students were more likely to try harder if it was a high-performing school, because they might have viewed it as a way out. So if the schools had low social capital skills, they stagnated no matter what. Schools with high social capital, only outside connections didn't have an impact on attendance, but like we said before, high social capital normally means stagnated attendance anyway, so it's probably not going to have that much of an impact. So the last 3 slides in this class really related to the book pull this all together. It shows you the importance of bonding and bridging social capital. It shows you that school improvement is much more challenging in communities with large numbers of children living under extraordinary circumstances. Supports matter, and schools with low social capital have to have more supports than schools with higher social capital. They already have them built in. It's the teaching staff. It's a matter of the teaching staff actually using them, though, now. So, what is the main takeaway messages? You need community social capital for school improvement. If children are living under extraordinary circumstances, none of the schools can achieve massive change. You have to have safety and organizational order first, and then schools have the capacity to improve. So fixing up the external and internal look and feel of the school actually matters more than any of the other stuff. Once that, you have community capacity and the institutional base in order to improve your schools. So this is it. This is the last slide related to Bryk, and like I said, you can view this on your own. There's a chapter summary and conclusions that might be worth you looking at. But focus your reading on things that actually interest you. 6 chapters in the book that are all independent. You shouldn't read all 6 of the chapters. I'd watch the video and I'd say, okay, this makes sense to me, this doesn't. So same with the articles that I'm going to present for you later in the class as well. So take what you want and use them. So now you have to delve in and explore the rest of the book on your own. Thank you very much.